My name is Robert Hale, 83 years old. I didn't plan to record this. Truth is, I don't even know if anyone will ever hear it. The house is quiet tonight. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes old memories walk around the rooms like they still live here. The refrigerator hums. The clock above the sink ticks louder than it should. And every now and then the floor creaks, even though no one is walking. When you get to my age, silence isn't empty, it's crowded. I've been thinking about religion a lot lately. Not the way I used to, not like sermons or rules or debates about who's right and who's wrong. Just thinking about it the way an old man does when most of his life is already behind him. I spent most of my life certain I understood it, certain I knew what God expected from me, certain I was doing the right things. That certainty felt good when I was young. It made the world feel organized, predictable, like there was a clear line between good people and bad ones, between belief and doubt, between heaven and everything else. Back then, I thought faith meant never questioning. I grew up in a small town where the church sat right in the center of everything. White wooden building, tall windows, a bell that rang every Sunday morning whether the sky was clear or pouring rain. My father never missed a service, not once. I remember the way he'd stand in the hallway early Sunday morning, straightening his tie in the mirror, while my mother pressed my shirt on the kitchen table. The smell of coffee and starch filled the house. "Time to go," he'd say, the same words every week. And we'd go. I must have sat in that same wooden pew thousands of times, same spot. Third row from the front, on the right side. My legs swinging when I was small, my feet finally touching the floor when I got older. The pastor's voice would echo through the building, rising and falling like a slow tide. Most of the time I didn't understand much of it, but that didn't seem to matter. Everyone nodded at the right moments. Everyone stood when they were supposed to stand. Everyone sang the same songs. It felt safe. Religion back then felt like something solid. Like a fence around life that kept everything important inside and everything dangerous outside. I carried that feeling with me for a long time. When I was 24, I married a woman named Helen. She had a quiet laugh, the kind that came out soft and surprised, like she hadn't meant to laugh but couldn't stop it once it started. We met at a church picnic. Funny thing is, I barely remember the sermon that day, but I remember the way sunlight caught in her hair while she was pouring lemonade. That memory has stayed with me longer than any verse I memorized. Helen believed in God too, but not the way I did. She didn't argue about doctrine. Didn't worry much about whether someone believed the right things. She just lived gently. If someone needed help, she helped them. If someone was hurting, she sat with them. No long speeches about faith, just small things. At the time, I didn't realize how different we were. To me, religion still meant structure, correctness, doing things the proper way. Sunday service, Bible study on Wednesdays, prayers before every meal. I believed those things were the proof of a faithful life. And for a while, I was proud of that. We raised 2 children in that same rhythm. Church clothes laid out on Saturday nights, morning services, holiday gatherings in the fellowship hall. I remember standing outside the church doors after services, shaking hands, talking about football scores and weather forecasts. Faith felt normal, routine, like something that would always be there. But life doesn't stay simple long enough for that kind of certainty. The first crack came quietly. It was the year my mother died. She'd been sick for months. Long hospital rooms with pale yellow walls and machines that beeped through the night. I remember sitting beside her bed, holding her hand while the pastor prayed softly at the foot of the bed. Everyone said the same things. It's part of God's plan. She'll be in a better place. Have faith. I nodded every time someone said those words, but something inside me felt unsettled, not angry, just confused. My mother had been the gentlest person I'd ever known. She spent her life caring for people who had less than we did, cooking meals for neighbors, visiting people who were sick or lonely. If anyone deserved more time, it was her. I remember driving home from the hospital one evening just before she passed. The sun was setting behind the trees, that orange color that only shows up for a few minutes before everything turns gray. And I had this strange thought I couldn't shake. All those years in church, all those prayers, and yet sitting beside her hospital bed, I realized I didn't actually understand what was happening at all. I still went to church after she died. I still bowed my head when everyone prayed, but something had shifted inside me. The certainty I carried for so many years, it had developed a small crack. And once a crack appears, it never really disappears, it just slowly spreads. Helen noticed the change before I ever said anything. One evening we were sitting on the back porch after dinner. The sky had that deep blue color that comes just before night settles in. Crickets were loud in the grass. She asked me a simple question. "Are you all right, Robert?" I remember staring out at the yard for a long time before answering. "I think so," I said. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't quite true. Something about losing my mother had left me with questions I didn't know how to ask, not the loud kind people argue about. Quieter ones, questions that show up when the house is dark and everyone else is asleep. I kept most of them to myself. Life kept moving, it always does. The children grew older. Helen started getting a few gray strands in her hair. My job at the hardware store turned into 35 years before I even noticed how long it had been. Every Sunday morning, the same church bell still rang. But the older I got, the more I began noticing something strange. The people who talked the most about religion weren't always the kindest people I knew. Some of the loudest voices about faith could be the hardest ones to sit beside. I remember a man named Carl who never missed a sermon, always quoted scripture, always had strong opinions about what counted as sin. But I also remember the way he spoke to his wife when he thought nobody was listening. Sharp words, cold ones. That bothered me more than I admitted at the time. Then there were other people who hardly ever spoke about religion at all. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 2 houses down, she brought soup to anyone who got sick on our street. Or a mechanic named Dennis who once fixed my car for free when money was tight after our daughter's surgery. Neither of them talked much about belief. But when I think back now, their kindness stayed with me longer than most sermons. It took me decades to notice that pattern. Decades. And by the time I finally started understanding it, most of my life had already passed. The biggest shift came later. Helen got sick when we were in our 70s. Cancer. I remember the exact afternoon the doctor said the word. There's a strange quiet that fills a room when something like that is spoken out loud, like the air itself pauses. Helen squeezed my hand under the table. She didn't cry. That was always her way. The months that followed were slow and heavy. Hospital visits again, waiting rooms with bad coffee. Long drives home where neither of us said much. People from church visited often. They prayed beside her bed. They brought casseroles and soft voices. And I appreciated it, I really did. But one night stands out more than the others. It was late. The hospital lights were dim. Helen was awake, staring toward the window. I asked her what she was thinking about. She smiled a little. "I'm not afraid," she said. I asked her why. She took a long breath before answering. "Because I think God is probably much quieter than we imagine." I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but that sentence stayed with me. Helen died 3 weeks later. The house changed after that. It's hard to explain unless you've lived through it. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Her coffee mug stayed in the cabinet. Her coat still hung by the door. But the small sounds that once filled the house, the laughter, the footsteps, the conversations about nothing important, they were gone. I still went to church for a while after she passed, but I noticed something strange. Sitting in that familiar pew, listening to words I had heard my entire life, I realized they no longer answered the questions that had slowly grown inside me. Not because the words were wrong, but because life had become bigger than the explanations I once held. Grief does that to a person. It stretches your understanding of things. I stopped going every Sunday after a while. Not out of anger, just quiet distance. These days I still think about God, probably more than I ever did when I was younger. But the way I think about religion now at 83 looks very different from the way I understood it at 20. Back then I thought faith was about certainty. Now, I'm not so sure. What I've noticed, after 8 decades of watching people live and struggle and love each other, is that the quietest moments often say the most. A hand held beside a hospital bed. A meal delivered to a lonely neighbor. A person sitting beside someone who's grieving without trying to explain it away. Those moments feel closer to something sacred than most arguments I've ever heard about belief. I don't have neat answers anymore. And strangely, that doesn't bother me the way it once would have. If anything, it feels more honest. At this age, life starts to look less like a set of rules and more like a long collection of moments that slowly teach you what really matters. Sometimes the understanding comes very late, much later than you expected. And if you've listened this far, maybe just sit with the story for a moment. You don't have to agree with an old man. But I suppose sometimes it helps, just hearing how a life unfolded.